G'day folks, and welcome to this side-by-side comparison of SpaceCorp 2025 to 2300 AD and High Frontier for All. Now, SpaceCorp 2025 to 2300 was designed by one of the greatest solitaire design system designers, John Butterfield. It was published by GMT Games in 2018, and it is a 1 to 4 player game. High Frontier for All is designed by a master of complex game design, Phil Eklund, along with Justin Gray, John Manka, and Dom Rugier. It was published by a collaboration of Ion Game Design, Sierra Madre Games, and a couple of others in 2020, and it can feature 1 to 5 players. Now, in both games, you as a player focus on launching expeditions into space. You will manage your voyage through space. You will land and explore asteroids, moons, planets. You will build bases in space, and you'll use those bases to facilitate further technological and economic development. So, space travel, space exploration, space bases, and space industrialization, making money in space are at the core of both of these games, and they evoke a somewhat similar feeling, a race into space, competing with other players for valuable assets, and a broad struggle to build a viable space economy of sorts. I very much enjoy them both, and they are staples in my collection, but they differ in their approach to these tasks. They treat these themes somewhat differently. And for those of you interested in space exploration and industrialization, I thought I'd do a comparison. So here we are. So what am I comparing here today? I'm focusing on the base games only. I will briefly note that SpaceCorp has a single expansion, Ventures, which primarily introduces diverse headquarters, in effect player mats, which have unique abilities. So each player will have a different sort of different headquarters with different abilities, different sort of starting cards and the like. In addition to the base game, High Frontier for All has 4 key modules, which I own. Each of these contain quite a range of scenarios, variants, optional rules, attachments, etc., that you can mix and match to create a myriad of different game experiences. I'm not comparing really those expansions today. I'm only comparing the multiplayer experience. Although again, I will note that both have solitaire versions. SpaceCorp has a system much like a Eurogame or Toma, which takes actions and competes with you for space. Literally, they will race out and try and grab things and compete with you. High Frontier for All has a few different options for solo play. You can create different types of solitaire rules based on these variants available, but you are principally competing to survive in this kind of economic and political sense. It's not quite the direct competition as in SpaceCorp. It's more a solo struggle against the odds of space exploration and the political and economic pressures that are placed on you. I will say very quickly, I'm not comparing those, but I will say very quickly, I think SpaceCorp is a better solo game. I'm not personally very impressed with the solo option in High Frontier for All. I feel very quickly that your options are even more restricted in that solo version compared to a multiplayer game of High Frontier for All, but I will add that it is quite easy to modify that by variants to fix it up based on your personal tastes. Now, the very first thing I want to say is, and point out, is the difference in complexity between the two. SpaceCorp has a weight rating, a complexity rating of 3 out of 5 on Board Game Geek, but I think it's a very easy game to learn and to teach. On each turn, you basically pick one of the range of possible actions to perform and carry out that action. The research action lets you draw new cards up to the research points you've spent on the cards you played. The move action lets you play move cards and to move your teams through space up to the move points you've spent on those cards. The explore action lets you play explore cards and to explore a site with your teams up to the explore points you've spent. The build action lets you play build cards to build with your teams on those explored sites up to the build points you've spent, and so on, just like that. You've got the gist of the core of gameplay. play cards, move, explore, and perform those actions up to the points you've played on the cards. On our very first game, we were able to grasp all the rules quite easily. It's very easy to teach, and to learn to a full potential, to learn all the rules within a matter of minutes, you're up and running. High Frontier for All, in contrast, is 4.84 out of 5 on Board Game Geek. It is one of the highest weighted games for complexity that I have seen on Board Game Geek. Now, for comparison, Campaign for North Africa, the infamous Campaign for North Africa, is 4.73. High Frontier, 4.84, exceeds that. And to address that complexity, High Frontier for All guides players through a series of smaller scenarios. First, you learn how to navigate through space. You learn how to use things like solar sails, then how to build and use fuel-powered rockets, how to manage your fuel. You learn how to land, how to explore, how to build factories, how to use those factories. Gradually through these scenarios, you build up an understanding of gameplay. You'll also be doing, you'll be performing that gameplay by taking a similar sort of set of actions called operations each turn, but the actions are far more numerous, more diverse, and more complex. There's simply more that you can do, and doing an action in High Frontier is more complicated than doing an action in SpaceCorp. There's simply more that you can do because there's a greater level of granularity and detail to these actions. You are literally moving the fuel one at a time onto your rocket, and then as you travel, you literally exhaust that fuel on your rocket one step at a time. Even once you know how to play High Frontier for All, when you know how to navigate, how to build a rocket, how to use that rocket, it remains a very complex game to play. You're often calculating your fuel load. You're trying to figure out to calculate in the vast solar system and its many navigational routes how far that fuel can take you over several turns. And there's no getting around it. It's complex calculations. And sure, whilst it gets a little easier with practice, you know how the system works, it never quite gets easy. It's never quite instinctive. You always have to make these vast calculations, look across the vast map and think about what you want to do. Indeed, one of the key reasons for High Frontier's complexity is because of the combination of the diverse components, for a start, that you put together to make your rocket, the many different ways that things can fit together to work, to make a workable engine that will go into space, and then the diverse options available to you on the map of what is a much more complex solar system, much more complex map of the solar system compared to SpaceCorp. SpaceCorp abstracts its movement to bare movement points. So for example, to move from Earth to Mars costs 9 movement points. To move from Earth to Halley's Comet costs 6 movement points. You basically add up a number of points in between, but it's quite an easy calculation. To move in High Frontier, you first need to collect the components to make your spacecraft go. It might be a rocket or a solar sail or a special kind of rocket, and you need to ensure you've stored enough of the fuel to make it go. You then need to move one space at a time through space, often burning fuel, to get through those navigational routes. You're making careful plans about the most efficient way to get to your destination, to land, to do whatever it is you wanted to do there, and then hopefully take off and return again. In short, it's a far more detailed process. And that really strikes at the core of these differences. In SpaceCorp, you have a team that moves, they're done. They explore, they're done. They do a build action, they're done. And you can do that over 3 consecutive terms quite quickly, in a matter of minutes, literally. Your decisions are often driven by what cards you have in your hand. So if you want to move, you have to play move cards that you collected from your hand. So if you have half a dozen move points on cards on the first map, you may decide to travel to Halley's Comet because Mars may be out of reach. There literally may only be 1 or 2 options available for you for movement, so you pursue the best option. It's a quick and easy decision to make. In High Frontier, it can take you 7, 8, 9 turns, operations, actions, just to collect the components to build your ship. Then once you have the components, you've put them together to build your spacecraft, you need to figure out how far it can travel, how far it can take you. Which means thinking about that fuel allocation, fuel consumption, in short, the maximum distance you can travel with that fuel. And looking around that vast map in High Frontier, you'll think, well, where do I want to go? Where can I feasibly go? What can I realistically achieve with what I've built here? You're often making decisions based on a mix of desire, I want to do here, I want to mine these resources, and capabilities. What can I realistically achieve with these parts that I'm putting together? Within the vast realm of spacecraft capabilities, what can you achieve? What do you want to achieve? And when you look at that map in contrast to SpaceCorp, the options are huge. There may be, on your turn, 30 to 40 different planets, moons, asteroids, Lagrange points in space that you can travel to. And when you finally pick one, there may be half a dozen to a dozen routes to take you there. You want to calculate the different paths and pick the one that, for you, for your particular ship, is most efficient. So in both games, you're doing much the same thing. Moving out into space, exploring those sites, asteroids, moons, building factories upon them, but there are completely different levels of complexities involved. So what are you striving for in these games? If you're doing the same thing, how are they at vastly different ends of the spectrum, and what are you striving for? What are you trying to do? Again, they're somewhat similar, but they're measured in different ways. In SpaceCorp, you gain profit, victory points in effect, by producing with the factories you've built, by exploring new sites, by building colonies in the distant universe, and importantly, achieving objectives on the business display, among a couple of other things. So whilst you may be moving, exploring, building, producing, you're often focusing on those larger objectives to gain the one-off bonuses for being the first to get there. The first person to achieve an objective claims the listed profit, victory points, and it can't be claimed by anyone else then. It's claimed, it's done. Once 6 objectives in an era are met, the era ends and the board changes. Yes, the board changes in SpaceCorp. For while space in High Frontier may be more dynamic and complex, and while SpaceCorp may appear simpler and more abstract, SpaceCorp runs over 3 different eras. The first era, Mariners, invites you to stretch out from Earth to Mars and its moons. Then you flip the map. The second era, Planeteers, involves you stretching out to the edges of the solar system and dealing with radiation and the vast distances of interplanetary travel, effectively requiring a lot more movement points from your cards. Then you change to a third map, and the third era, Starfarers, thrusts you out into deep space where you explore other star systems. You begin to set up colonies in the far reaches. In each era, the map, the rules, the deck of cards you're using as a basis for your actions all change. This means that the gameplay evolves and changes with each era. Now, you're still moving, exploring and building, performing those base actions, but you may gain new actions. There are new threats, there are new challenges and opportunities, and of course, new objectives on the business board driving your ambitions, driving what you're trying to achieve. In High Frontier, you gain victory by doing somewhat similar things, but in a more open sandbox type of environment. You basically get VPs for building things, rockets, claims on planets, factories, the value of factories, colonies, and so forth in the base game. But scoring only happens at the end of the game, and you basically just add up everything you've done. So in SpaceCorp, you're always driving for objectives which change. You're competing for short-term objectives, often racing to be the first to build on 3 planets or settle a colony. And you'll move from one short-term objective to the next. Okay, now I've built the colony, I'll aim to have a colony value of 16. And then once I've done that, I'll aim to be the first to build a base on 4 different regions. And then so on. You move from one to the next, always gaining small bites of profit or victory points along the way. In High Frontier, it's a wide open solar system for you to explore, settle, and produce upon. You're not trying necessarily to be the first to do something necessarily. You're often focused on setting a more personal goal, such as building a factory on Mars so you can build a certain efficient space rocket that will give you 4 times the fuel efficiency you had to enable you to head off to the moons of Jupiter to exploit it for more valuable resources. It may be worth something at the end of the game, but it's also really satisfying when you get that job done. You've set yourself a private objective and you've achieved it, and it's really satisfying when it all comes together. Okay, so what does this mean for the feel of the 2 games? How do they feel to play and how are they different? Well, this is another key difference. In SpaceCorp, you are driven by those set objectives. You look at the business board and develop a short-term plan to achieve 1, 2, 3, or 4 of them. In High Frontier, you're setting really your own objectives based on your evolving and changing capabilities. And again, that changes over time. A new rocket part may appear that doubles your fuel capacity. So you modify your plans, and instead of heading to Mars, you head to a more valuable distant asteroid. Yes, you still move, build, industrialize, but it's more on your own terms and in far more greater detail. In net terms, this makes SpaceCorp a far more accessible game. You can sit down with friends, teach them the game relatively quickly, run through a game, and be done in 2 to 3 hours. In High Frontier, it's recommended you run through 1 to 2, 3 smaller navigational scenarios first before heading into the full game. Experienced gamers can play through a game in maybe 2 to 3 hours, but they will need to be experienced. At the end of a game of SpaceCorp, the player with the most profit wins. You simply look at the profit or VP chart, and that's it. Person ahead wins. You might reflect on how you achieved those VPs, but there's not really much of a grand narrative arc to reflect on. You're doing all these little things that add up to a big score, and it's kind of hard to remember what you did in the first era, what you did in the second era. There are all these little bite-sized chunks of victory points, a point salad in a way. At the end of the game of High Frontier, you're telling these fascinating stories about what you personally achieved. Victory points are an indicator of success, but you're often talking more about what you wanted to do, where you failed, what you managed to pull from the backseat of your spaceship as it hobbled onto that valuable asteroid with its last ounce of rocket fuel. There is a satisfying personal reward for all those complex decisions and calculations that you've made along the way. It's about how you've done personally, how you've overcome the odds of having to build this immense rocket with its crew and send it to the vast reaches of space and back again to Earth. Whilst you're technically competing for profit and claims, it's really about the story that you can tell your kids about your famous voyage to Io or Triton. But of course, that comes at the expense of heavily burnt out brain cells at the end of your journey because of the complexity involved. So bringing this all together, while the two games cover very similar themes, they do so in vastly different ways. I love them both. I would easily recommend SpaceCorp to anyone with an interest in space, travel, exploration, industrialization, and board gaming in general. It's a fascinating board game to play for gamers. I would recommend High Frontier to a much narrower audience, only those who are really prepared for a lengthy and complex journey, not only in learning the game, but each time you sit down to play. Folks, I recommend you check them both out, seeing what's of interest. I hope that's been of benefit to you. Thanks for watching, and take care.